Welcome to Team English National Conference 2020 from a really unusual setting of our homes. We would love to have been with you in real and hosted a session together. Me and Alice were going to do a session on building a reading culture in schools from the bottom up and from the top down. But obviously coronavirus lockdown have put a stop to that. So first of all, I'm Fiona Ritson. You'll find me at Always Learn Web, and Alice Furay at A Visser Furay. So we're going to start off. Alice is going to talk about all the amazing things that she does. If you haven't seen Alice on Twitter, she's a joy. She lives, breathes, eats, talks, books more than anybody I know. I thought myself and Freya were pretty hot on it, but actually Alice is taking the hot spot. So Alice is going to talk to you. She's going to introduce herself, and then she's going to talk to you about how she's built a reading culture in schools, and I'll ask her a few questions along the way.
Brilliant, thank you. And Fiona, you are amazing with books, as so many people on Twitter are engaged with books and celebrating reading, etc. So I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to be able to talk to the English community today. And as Fiona said, we're talking about reading, building a reading culture for all, and developing quality whole school reading to improve academic excellence. That's the title of our presentation. We could talk about this for 3 days. So please do catch us on Twitter or check our resources available on our websites if you want to have more information, because this is something we could go on and on about for a while. So we're going to do this in sort of a question answer format. So do you want to ask me your first question?
Yes. If you can just tell me a little bit, please, about your school to begin.
Right, yeah, I think it's always quite important to know the context of a particular school. And I work in a comprehensive school. It's a large comprehensive, about 1,800 students. We're a two-site school, so that's a bit unusual. There's years 7 and 8 on one site, and years 9 through 13 on another site. It's rural Oxfordshire, quite a lot of white working class, and there are significant numbers of families who might have low aspirations. When you're thinking about context, though, it's more than the school, it's also what the school is like. And when I came to King Alfred's, there was almost no reading culture. So the library was used for detentions. In fact, there was no library for students on the other site. It had been torn down and made into a computer room. There was no discussion of reading for pleasure by anybody, including English teachers. We didn't monitor reading attainment. We had no idea of where students were at with their reading. There were an intervention group, which was basically bottom set, and they were making negative progress. Literacy was spag. So there was a lot of work to be done when I started at King Alfred's, and I just wanted to send out the message that sometimes it's an uphill battle, but you can get up the hill with a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, excellent. So I think it's really important to discuss context. We talk about this all the time. You've talked to me before many times about beginning with the end in mind. What actually do you mean by that? And as far as building a reading culture for all is concerned?
Yeah, so when I thought about changing what King Alfred's was like as far as reading is concerned, I thought, well, I need to start at the end. Where do I want King Alfred's to be in 5 years' time? So the main thing I thought about is that reading needs to be a core value of King Alfred's. It needs to be a thread throughout the school, embedded throughout the school. In order for that to happen, there has to be, in our school, in our context, there must be effective libraries that are staffed and that are well stocked. So those were sort of my first two starting points. And then I thought, well, what do I want for the students? I want them to leave school confident in their reading, confident in their literacy. And as a result of that, I know that their outcomes will be improved. And I was particularly concerned about students who struggle because they find reading difficult, or who are reluctant and therefore don't read as much as they should do and aren't making the progress. So I wanted to put in place rigorous intervention systems where we monitor students, and then we put in place interventions to help them close that gap. So that's sort of what I wanted to achieve overall. And I knew that this couldn't be done overnight. As I said, you know, it's quite a mountain to climb. It's a process, a journey that you would take over a number of years.
So just before we move on to the next question, would you think that people who just think, or teachers or schools who feel they can do one initiative, a notice board, or promote World Book Day, for example, and we do all of those things. But would you say people who just think they can do one initiative and then forget about it, that's really kind of where the start, it's
no,
relentless.
it's not a reading culture. I mean, those are worthy initiatives, right? So World Book Day is fabulous, worthy initiatives, but it doesn't build a reading culture. It needs to be, as I said, a thread throughout every single thing that happens at the school. And I'll talk a bit more later about how we built that reading culture, but just doing World Book Day is not enough.
Excellent. What are the most important things people should know about transforming reading attitudes in a school?
Right, so I thought carefully about that. So building a reading culture, that's our goal. I thought carefully about what actually do you need in order to build a reading culture. And I came up with these 4 adjectives: be enthusiastic, relentless, strategic, and resilient. Enthusiastic is just in your interactions with students every single day, in your interactions with staff, in your interactions with parents. Constantly show that passion for books and for reading. And, you know, part of showing that passion for books and reading is reading books yourself. So I'm a huge advocate. In order to build a reading culture, you need to have staff reading. And that you can communicate your enthusiasm for books. This whole idea of being relentless, and that is, again, with students and with staff and with parents, keep at it all the time. So every single time a senior leadership team member sees me, they know I'm going to have something to say about reading and something to ask them about reading. And it's again and again and again. Same with students who say, oh, I hate reading, or I never read, etc. I never give up. Relentless. Strategic, what I'm thinking about there is thinking about how best to make the sale, and that is to senior leadership as well as to students. So how do you convince senior leadership to invest in building a reading culture? What do you do? What do you focus on? And being strategic about when you approach senior leadership, asking perhaps to speak to governors as well. So thinking the big picture, get the stakeholders on board, but also being strategic with how you do CPD for staff to get everybody on board. You're not going to want to force them to do loads of things because that can be counterproductive, but to get them, hearts and minds campaign is what I talk about. So being strategic about that. And then I talked about being resilient, because you're going to have some negativity that happens in every single school. There's going to be things that go wrong, initiatives that fall flat on their face. And I would say just being aware that you'll get further. It might be 3 steps forward, 1 step back, but being resilient and picking yourself back up again. You know, and linked to all that, there's things that are linked to that. I talked there about taking ownership, asking for allocated time. It's linked to all those values. If you want to build a reading culture, say, I'm going to work on this together with a team of people. And I think you should ask senior leadership, I need timetable time to be able to do this effectively, right? And you can explain why and be strategic about showing them the impact of the change in reading culture, the impact that it will bring.
Excellent. I just want to go back to a couple of things you said. So I'm just thinking of people watching this.
Yeah, that's all right.
You said to be enthusiastic. You need to get parents and teachers, staff on board. Actually, why? Because actually it's just children that need to read. So why do we need to really bother about parents and teachers? Why not just infuse the students?
Well, it's a good question, but students, of course, have a variety of different people that influence them, and teachers that they respect, the PE teacher and a teacher from science, for example. If those teachers are encouraging them, teachers that they respect, they're more likely to be motivated to find something to read. And of course, parents, they spend more time at home with parents than anybody else. So if you can get parental engagement, that's probably crucial. It is challenging, I will admit that, particularly for families where perhaps there are reluctant readers. But if you can get parents on board, young people spend more time with their parents than anybody else. So I guess the more people that you're working together with, the more effective it's going to be.
Yeah, and just one other thing is you did mention about talking to senior leadership team, and in particular you actually talk about governors. Now, as you know, with schools, some people can get really protective about governors meetings, and some people have never ever been to one. How do you advise somebody to go about getting involved in getting in front of a head and talking about all of this and getting in front of governors? How would you advise somebody to do that?
Good question. Yeah. So As I said, had to build a reading culture, and there wasn't sort of an intuitive sense that people thought this was important. I had to make the argument. And the way I started was with a couple of key members of the senior leadership team. And I built an argument. So I showed them, for example, in the new GCSEs, what the reading age requirements of the business extracts are. And they're really high reading ages. And I knew that this particular deputy head was a business teacher, right? So I took texts that he would have to teach himself and showed him how difficult these are. So I got key members of senior leadership on board, explained exactly what I wanted to do with that 5-year strategy I talked about earlier. And once they were on board, it was quite easy to go to the governors because it became part of the larger teaching and learning profile that we have as a school. And especially once I was able to start to show impact, and I've got some information about that later, the governors are responsible for the overall teaching and learning, and they're responsible for how we invest money. So for example, the catch-up funding, which is a major source of funding for a lot of schools for students who have not made expected progress when they come into secondary, that funding governors have an overview of, and they want to know what's happening with that funding. And so that is sort of my way in talking about teaching, learning, impact, talking about what we're doing with this money to change outcomes and life chances for young people.
Excellent. You've obviously already touched on some of the bits that we're going to ask next, but obviously specifically, where should somebody who is responsible for raising achievement through reading, where should a school begin to developing this culture?
Yeah. So, I mean, it does depend on your context. For a comprehensive school like mine, where there are significant numbers of students who do not have books at home, really important to have a dynamic, staffed library, right? I would start there for a school like mine. And it needs to be an updated collection. So that was where I started to make sure our library was a dynamic place. Of course, it's expensive. Books are expensive. So we visit charity shops. We ask for donations. Now with lockdown, there's a huge opportunity. Many people have had a clear out. And a colleague just told me today that she's been gifted 400 books from people that no longer need them because they've had a clear out. So asking for books, you can sort them out which ones you want and you don't want, but invest in new ones, of course, right? And I'm a huge believer in book lists and in new books for students, but also be sensible if your budget is limited about using charity shops and other mechanisms. I would also say go make sure you've got books for those struggling and reluctant readers. I'm a huge fan of the Barrington Stoke books. They're dyslexia friendly. So it's worth investing in those sorts of books because they engage, and I've seen it happen time and time again, reluctant readers or struggling readers. And I've mentioned there catch-up funding can be used for that. Now, just last week, they announced that the current system of catch-up funding is going to be canceled for the next year, but there's that huge pot of money that's going to go to schools as a result of COVID-19, that's catch-up funding. And some of that funding should go into providing resources and books for students who struggled the most during lockdown. So I would say this is about being strategic again. There's going to be funding available. Get your hand in there and say this funding needs to go for the students who need it the most.
And I think hopefully one of the key messages people listening to this chat is going to understand is you can't sit and wait for somebody to come to you and say, here's a 500, 1,000, 5,000 pound, whatever the budget is, here's some money, go away and spend it. You have to go to SLT, the governors, your bursar, your business manager, and ask them for the money.
You have to be proactive. It's not going to come from the top. They have so many things to think about, right? They have, juggling 300 balls at once. You need to get in there and push. And, this is the whole idea of being relentless again.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, go on.
Excellent. Okay, I was just going to move on to the next question.
Okay, but I just want to talk just briefly before we go on about whole school reading policy. That in addition to having a staff library, you need to have, as I mentioned several times already, support from all teachers and SLT. At our school, we now say, as sort of our tagline, we are a reading school. And that's a message that comes straight from the head teacher and from SLT. Yeah. And it's one of the first messages that students get when they come into the school. All students must have a book with them at all times. And that's not enforced just by English teachers. It's checked in the morning by tutors, by the head teacher goes around, everybody hold up your book, etc. They have an opportunity to go to the library during breaks and tutorials to get books if they don't have them. And then we have 10 minutes of silent reading at the end of it, at the beginning of every English lesson, but also in multiple other lessons, in addition to the hour per fortnight, which I'll talk about shortly.
Yeah. That's fantastic, and I just love we're a school that reads. You know,
I know you do.
Have that on there.
You've done a brilliant job with
fabulous.
that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so moving on just a little bit to Accelerator Reader. Many schools do use many reading programs, and Accelerator Reader comes up so much. So really my question is, it does have varied success. How do you use it at your school effectively?
Yeah, so for us, Accelerated Reader has been transformational. And that's because we've learned to use it quite effectively. It took some time. We've had Accelerated Reader. This is our 4th year now. First and second year wasn't great. One reason why it's been transformational is they're able to monitor students and where they're at with their reading. We do the STAR tests 4 times a year, so we can see exactly where students are and whether or not they're making progress. We give students a standardized score, which we don't tell them their reading age. We give them a standardized score. The standardized score is like their Key Stage 2 SATs, so they understand it. So they try to get to 100 or above, and they monitor their own progress. And actually, it's quite motivational for them. We have an Accelerated Reader lesson, which is once per fortnight. It's actually in the classrooms, but they can go to the library if needed during the lesson. And they're expected to quiz on books most AR lessons. Not everyone. It might be they're reading a 1,000-page book and they haven't finished in 2 weeks. That's fine. But they should be quizzing most AR lessons. And if they're not, that's the job of the AR teacher to monitor and say, well, is the book too hard? You're not enjoying it, etc. So students track what they're reading, and you can see the impact of that. We've got from 17 to 18 as compared to last year. Last year we went up to 410 million. And I checked this morning for our stats this year. Obviously, we're missing a big chunk of the year, but we're already at 261 million words read this year, which is not as great as last year, but the shutdown, of course.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And we also have, I mentioned the teachers. We've got teachers who are invested in AR. It's not just any random teacher that comes in and does this lesson. For next year, actually, we have 4 leadership members of the English leadership team. So all 4 of us that are doing AR lessons are fairly senior and experienced with leading AR lessons, as well as keen readers ourselves. So we're really careful about the staffing we put in place. So this year it was 3, next year it's 4. And we make sure those lessons are about personalized advice for each student. And we have whispered conversations with students. You check on particularly students you think are reluctant or struggling in most AR lessons. And then we do the whole celebration of success. I'm delighted that last year we had 132 word millionaires. This year we have 83 so far. Of those, 46 are boys. And this is the same as last year. It's 55 to 60% of our word millionaires are boys. So that's sort of bucking a national trend. Yeah. The boys are proud to wear their word millionaire badges. We do awards and competitions, which motivates some. Others are more intrinsically motivated. But we do a whole range of things to ensure that we make the most of the Accelerated Reader program.
Yeah, just a couple of little questions.
Yep.
So why do you feel it didn't succeed in the first couple of years? What wasn't great about it?
Okay, we did not have initially a AR lesson, right? So we just had reading for 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning of English lessons. But that was then not enforced very well, was not monitored. There was nobody in charge to monitor what students were reading. So we had students reading a wimpy kid the entire year, right? Most students weren't encouraged to quiz on books. In fact, there was no possibility for them to do that in lessons. We now have iPads that we bring into lessons so they can quiz. And we also didn't have anybody in charge of AR. So we've got an AR leader. It's a different person to me. She has an hour a fortnight timetable where she takes care of things like sending out emails to the AR teachers. This is the latest thing that you need to work on. She sends emails for all word millionaires to the parents of the word millionaires. She sorts out the badges for word millionaires, those sorts of things. And obviously we have the support of the library assistant as well.
Yeah, so again, just to recap a couple of points there that you've said that I think people will be really interested in, is make sure somebody is responsible for AR. If you just kind of bring it in and hope it's going to work. It is an expensive program, so use it effectively. Get your SLT involved,
right.
And it's just we'll talk about boys later on, or perhaps in the second half, but really great points.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question. Some people might say that reading shouldn't be about rewards and competitions, but instead we just should really celebrate the joy of reading. How do you develop a love for reading, particularly with students that are reluctant?
Yeah, so that's something, I want students to have an intrinsic love of reading. The issue is that you can't wave a magic wand and make that happen, right? So you need to put a number of systems in place to make sure that you reach everybody. And one way that we do that is we target students that we think will benefit. So we do, for example, a breakfast and books club for PP students. We target students that we think will benefit. They come in before school and we give them individual support. We've had, as part of that, we've got 2 working dogs, and the dogs sit in the library with the students, and the students can read to a dog. So that's been really successful. We also get the SEND and the PP team to pick out students that they think should have individual support from me or from somebody else on the team. And we target them, for example, for something like Carnegie. So for Carnegie shadowing last year, we had 95 students participating, and all those students read 3 or more books. Most read more than that. It's a massive number. So when I had the celebration, I had to break it into 2 celebrations. And lots of those students were the more reluctant and struggling ones because we targeted them, right? So we said, oh, you really like this. And we used that enthusiasm I talked about, along with some strategic thinking about who would benefit the most, along with the whole idea, there's a party at the end, right? Which was motivational as well. And by participating in this, the intrinsic motivation develops. So the more success they have, the more like, actually, I am a reader. And that's what I want to change, is I want people to see themselves as readers. That doesn't happen overnight, but we put a number of events and activities in place to support. I also have, I do various reading bingos, including one for lockdown I will show later, but I also have challenges for staff. As I mentioned, staff are readers too. And over the lockdown period, I actually had a really successful series of challenges, 3 challenges for staff to read 3 different books for young people. This is all staff. So it's office staff, cleaning staff, teachers, of course, and a whole range of adults. And the idea is that when the students see the adults around them, all the adults around them, able to talk about books, interested in books, they will be more motivated as well. And obviously, we talked about the support that I offer for, that we offer for students, parents, and teachers. That includes lots of book lists, which I regularly update. We do book sales at every parents' evening. So we get books from the charity shop and we sell them on for 50p, books that we don't need for the library, because book ownership is quite important, and having a book at home is something different than just borrowing it from the library. And then obviously the individualized support and challenges for students that are particularly at risk.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, moving on to the next question. Around 25% of students come to secondary school having not made expected progress in reading, and many actually are several years behind their peers. What do you do to support those students?
Yeah, so there's the lockdown reading bingo, which I'll have a link to in the presentation. The next sort of area that I mentioned that's really, really important to me to support the struggling readers. And as you said, it's 25% of students coming in who are behind where they need to be with their reading. So we have put in place a lot, way too much for me to cover in a short presentation. I think it starts with knowing which students to target. So of course we use the Key Stage 2 reading SATs data, but we also then use the STAR test. We have that data fairly quickly in September, and we see which students are significantly behind. The way that we're able to do that is because we've got the accelerated reader for all Key Stage 3 students. We put in place then interventions to help the students we think are most at risk, and the one that I've been just thrilled with the impact of is the reading partner intervention. It's a one-on-one intervention, and it's basically, I had 12 volunteers, all older people, all retired people from the community that I trained, and they come in once a week or sometimes twice a week to read one-on-one with students. And it's just so lovely. It's like a grandparent relationship, and some of these children don't have that. And they sit there for a half an hour and read with them a book of the student's choice, or sometimes I use nonfiction texts on a topic that the student's interested in. And we had just massive results. We did it this year. In about 3 months, they made 12 months progress. And the previous year, they had made 19 months progress in about 6-7 months. So really significant. This year also, we developed what I call the Reading Scholars Program for our PP students, and that is a sustained intervention. So often there's an intervention that's a few weeks or a couple of months, and then they fall through the cracks. What we're trying to do is monitor them and make sure that the interventions stay in place for those that need them. And the Reading Scholars is a sustained intervention that we anticipate will take place over their years until year 11. So if it's a year 7 student, it lasts for 5 years, right? These are students that are significantly behind, and they're getting once a fortnight, half an hour, one-on-one intervention with a member of staff who's also been trained. And depending on the student, sometimes it's a decoding intervention, others they were doing more reciprocal reading strategy. So it depended quite a lot on that. And then we have all kinds, I mean, I'm not going to go through everything here because there's just a wealth of interventions that we have going. The reason why we have so many is that there's no magic wand again. You can't find a single solution to solve a reading barrier for a student. This is developed over many years and it takes some time to fix. So we've got different interventions for different purposes. One of the things that I'm really pleased with is the training that we've done for the volunteers, but also for what we call the S-band teachers. Those are the teachers of the students across all the subjects who are our very weakest students, have significant needs. So I provided a whole CPD session for these students explaining exactly the nature of the barriers that these students have, then specific strategies of how they as a PE teacher or a science teacher might support reading development in these students, right? So we've got all that. There's loads of other sorts of things, and I talk at the end about never give up. And it's this thing, you know, I have students where, you know, I've been 2 years, 3 years, and I keep working in it, but eventually you do break through if you're relentless and remain enthusiastic.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely phenomenal what you do. And again, it's really interesting listening to you speak, because the key messages are there is no one single initiative that will work on the level that you'll want it to. It has to be, I always think you have to come at it from every angle. You have to come at it from, for 20 students, one thing might work, for another 50, something else might work.
Exactly.
It's also sometimes working up, down, down, up. So I think, you know, it's just interesting how much of what you say, although you come at it from a different education sector, does actually work.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're on to our last question. And what impact has all of this had?
Yep. So this is just a slide with the training, or part of the training, one slide from the training, and I broke reading down into categories. And you wonder, you know, overall, all these interventions that we put in place and the use of accelerated reader and various events and activities, what sort of impact has that got? Well, I've got a couple of slides here that link into that. These are really effective when you're presenting to SLT or to the governors because you can see quite dramatically the impact for various groups. So the reading intervention group, you can see, as I already mentioned, there was 19 months progress. And I looked at other categories as well. And you could see for the reading intervention group, it was 19 months progress as opposed to 10 months for the whole cohort. So there was a closing in the gap there, which is what we're looking at. But I wanted to talk a little bit more because I talked about this mountain that you have to go up. And this slide here shows the trajectory. So catch-up students, as I mentioned earlier, are the students who come into your school that have not made expected progress in reading or maths. It's about 25%, sometimes more, with both subjects combined. So for us, it's always around 90 or 100 students that are in that category. And when we looked at their progress in the 2016-17 year, their reading ages went down after a whole year with us, right? It was not effective, our provision. Then 17-18, we started to turn the ship around, but you know, we didn't have enough effective interventions in place for this particular group. And then you can see in last year's, we really started to begin to close the gap. These are students that need sustained intervention, still not where I'd want it to be. This is a large group, it's 90 to 100 students, Whereas say the reading partner, that is about 40 students, right? So we targeted about 40 students. They made more progress, but the other 50 didn't make quite as significant, but still you can see that we're beginning to turn it around. And the last one, moving it to an individual. What does that look like for an individual student? So this child, when he came into school, was a read file child, very complex, a bit surly and quite challenging. His stage 2 SATs reading was very low, as was his initial reading test. And he had reading age 8 when he came to us at the beginning of year 7. He read quite a lot during year 7, so those interventions that we had in that year for him had an impact. He was up to 100 by the beginning of year 8. But in throughout year 8, this child, because of the various things we put in place, he was highly motivated by the word count in Accelerated Reader. He read almost 3 million words. And this child then, if you look at the reading age transformation, 14 years, from 8 years to 14 years within the period of 2 years. And you can see across subjects, the grades that he was receiving, the marks he was receiving, in our system, it's below expected, expected, above expected, were transformed, right? So you can see that he's doing much, much better. And he also changed learning paths. So it was just so inspiring to see for an individual child, as well as for groups, as well as for a whole cohort, the difference that building a reading culture can have.
Just before we end on that, on the last 2 slides that you had, what was they're both I remember I've had Accelerator Reader in my old school. They're both snapshots of reports from Accelerator Reader, aren't they?
That's right.
One of the great things about Accelerator Reader is it does have all these reports that you can then use
exactly
to help support your requests at SLT and governors.
Exactly, the strategic. Yeah, so for me, initially we didn't use Accelerated Reader very effectively, but I had the data to show what we were doing as an effective, which helped me to then convince the SLT and the governors. And so absolutely, it's been brilliant. So, you know, it's sort of the key messages. It's those 4 adjectives: being enthusiastic, relentless, strategic, and resilient. And with those 4 things, if you have those 4 qualities, then you'll be able to build a reading culture over time. No magic wand. It's a long journey, but you'll get there.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Alice. I mean, it is phenomenal what you do, and to listen to you speak and to hear the ideas that you put forward. What we'll do now is we're going to split this into 2 sessions. So we'll end this one now, and then we'll do a part 2 where I'll then discuss the things that we've done. But what is really, really interesting about all of this is you cannot promote reading if you don't read yourself.
Absolutely.
And you know, you have to read these books, and you enjoy it. And what I enjoy and what I like listening to you is, you know, a child. So when a child comes to you and says, can I have a new book? You'll say, oh, I think you're going to like X, Y, Z, because you know the child and you know the book.
Tailored.
So, okay, all right.
Super.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was a pleasure. Thank you.